Hello, everybody. Hey, welcome to the MinistryBuilders.Church podcast. I'm Wayne Lanier. So glad you're here. We've got a great conversation today. Listen, we're talking digital discipleship. We're talking about technology and the church. How are we discipling people in a digital age? And so we're going to have a great conversation. And so I'm excited to have my friend, Dr. Todd Korpi, on the podcast with me today. Todd, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Wayne?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So I don't know. Do I call you Dr. Korpi? Do I talk? Just we go with Todd. We just go. I've known you for a long time. So when I
Yeah,
first got to
yeah,
know you, you were progressing into your doctorhood shipness. I don't even know what to say anymore. And so
Dr.
I'm
Hood.
just kidding.
I
I'm
like that.
kidding with you. I'm kidding with you. I'm kidding with you. But hey, so anyway, I'm just joking around with you. So introduce yourself, Todd. Tell everybody a little bit about you. Your family, what you do, what you're involved in.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Todd, and our family lives in the Chicagoland area in the west suburbs. And I've been married to my wife, Tara, for just under 16 years. And we have three girls. So I'm a girl dad and proud of it. And yeah, so I have a couple different irons in the fire, but I'm a missiologist by vocation, which means that I kind of study and teach at the intersection of Christianity and culture. So how can the church effectively communicate and incarnate the gospel in the unique cultures to which God has called us. And so part of that I teach at Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm an assistant professor there. I also am the dean of a new digital ministry program at Ascent College in Virginia. And then I work as the lead researcher of the Billy Graham Center, or of the Digital Mission Consortia at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, kind of exploring the landscape of digital ministry there. And then finally, I also work at One Hope, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to scripture engagement, specifically with children and youth, based out of Fort Lauderdale. And I steward One Hope's relationship with the World Assemblies of God Fellowship, trying to plant churches all around the world over the next 10 years. So that's kind of
Wow.
in a nutshell. That's
Yeah.
what we've got going on.
That's a
So
lot, Todd. That's a lot. You have
it
your
is,
hands
yeah.
in a lot, and so I'm just thrilled to that you were able to carve out some time to join me today. I just feel like this is an important conversation, and this will be the beginning of hopefully what will be many other future conversations with you and others in this, if you will, in this space of looking at, understanding, researching the digital world that we live in and how we leverage this for ministry, for discipleship, and so forth. So why don't you? What's really this? There's a big conversation. I mean, obviously, you head up a huge research group around this area, this topic. So what's really driving the conversation? And how do you think? How should we begin to think about this whole idea of digital discipleship, digital ministry?
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which we all recognize to one degree or another that our kind of digital existence is not only not going away, but it's rapidly changing. So there's this kind of felt recognition that we live in this permanently altered sort of world where we kind of have one foot in digital spaces and one foot in our physical existence. And but that even looks different than it did 20 years ago. When I was in high school, I still had to physically sit down at my computer and log online in order to go on the internet and have conversations on AOL Instant Messenger and whatnot. And that's a bygone era that no longer exists. Nobody logs on to the internet anymore. We're kind of in this existence which is simultaneously always online and offline. My dishwasher is connected to the internet more than I was personally as a teenager, growing up in the early 2000s. And so but then there's this felt kind of gap that we've seen a lot of local church pastors communicate, where they recognize there's a lot that we could potentially do But there's also kind of this felt need that we're not really hitting the mark. We could potentially do more, do better, and a lot of church leaders are just simply trying to do the best they can, with what people power they have, with what resources that they have. But COVID really kind of accelerated this conversation as many of our, ecclesiologies, the way that we do church, had to shift for a period of time to an online only sort of format, whether that was communicating directly with congregants, whether that was holding services over Zoom or broadcasting or whatever. But now that we're on the other side of this, there's this, I remember when we were in COVID and when you and I were working together at that time, how many times did you hear the term, when we get back to normal, there's this, when we get back to normal. And the reality is that we're in a new normal. We're kind of in an inflection point where life and ministry is going to look dramatically different, even 5 years from now than it has in the 15 years that I've been in pastoral ministry prior to COVID. So when it comes to discipleship, one of the questions, kind of one of the question marks that's emerged in digital spaces is how do we do that effectively? And a lot of leaders have expressed this need to do things better, but feeling ill-equipped to be able to do that. So the Digital Mission Consortium really sought out to kind of understand what's kind of the landscape of digital ministry today, who's doing what, kind of what are some best practices that we can learn from, and how do we distill that into some evergreen principles that we can apply in our ministry that doesn't take a dedicated online staff to be able to minister effectively in digital spaces. And so we wanted to understand kind of what's the ecosystem that we're in when we're in digital spaces. How do we minister effectively, and specifically on this area of in evangelism and in the area of discipleship, how do we do that well in a way that is more than just kind of flooding the internet with more and more content?
Yeah, yeah, and I think to that last point, I think maybe that has been the kind of the predominant thought across for a lot of us, especially in the during COVID and now coming out as we came out of COVID, was that we had a content issue, and
Yeah.
that the more content we could produce, the better things would be. And I think what you're hitting on is that it's not necessarily a content issue. There are other factors that we need to consider. I want to read something, Todd, that you wrote. Matter of fact, that this is in, and I'll have a link to this in the description below to Todd's Substack, because you want to read some of the things that he's writing there. He's got some great stuff. But I want to read something, Todd, that you wrote, and I want to get you to comment on it because I think
Sure.
it helps this conversation quite a bit. And I'm quoting you here. You wrote, "We tend to think of discipleship as getting people the right information to absorb so that they can doctrinally align with the right things to be considered a Christian, and thereby reorient their lives accordingly." An approach to the discipleship, you called it. You said it's getting people in the right classroom with the right sources to learn the right things, right?
Yeah.
And that really sums up well what I discovered. I've been a pastor now for 38 years, and so in these years, I think for the longest time, I remember early on it was about people had to have the right doctrine, right? So it was
Hmm.
about the right beliefs. Then it became about if I could get you through the right things, and you had if you had the right check marks next to I took this class, I did this course, I did this thing, I did that, right? And then it's kind
Right.
of continued to progress there. But I think we many of us have come to realize there's a vast difference between what we were defining as discipleship and the way we saw it modeled for us in the scriptures. So talk a little bit about that. Like, first of all, how did we get here? And how do we help pastors and ministry leaders make that shift in their paradigm in regards to discipleship? And that's really two questions there, but I'll let you jump on that as you will.
Yeah, so it's kind of multifaceted as these things often are. We got here really the kind of the beginnings of um, where we are now actually stretch back to the third and fourth century AD, when as Christianity began to spread, its majority ethnic group began to shift from being Jewish to being Greek, and the Greeks had a very different kind of approach to knowledge gathering and to even how they interpreted the faith that we see even extend in the centuries that follow, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church and some of the kind of architects of that branch of our Christian family tree. And so you had kind of this shift from what we refer to as orthopraxy to orthodoxy. And so Christianity went from being organized similarly to other Jewish sects, which was a kind of a way of living. It was a way of, and so knowledge and action were deeply connected to one another. As Greek influence began to emerge in the church, that began to shift to an orthodoxy, which meant that Christianity was primarily about affirming the right doctrinal statements and alignments. And so and now we fast forward over the course of time. We have emerge on the stage, movements historically like the Enlightenment, which again prioritize kind of a very not only the place of learning being in kind of a sage on the stage communicating to pupils, that pedagogy type of model, but then also this dynamic of what we call the doctrine of perpetual progress, meaning that from the Enlightenment we got this idea that humankind can continuously better itself, and that has taken shape now into really kind of this culture of more, that we understand the next step is more, it's better, it's bigger, it's this and that. So, as all this is taking place, pastors have often been, within their respective communities, the primary source of knowledge and depth. Clergy were often those within any particular village or community that had some of the largest libraries. And so, if you wanted to understand something, if you wanted to know the answer to something, you asked your pastor. And that pastor became this well of religious knowledge, that they would be able to dispense answers, and quell matters of doctrinal controversy and all that kind of stuff, to the people in their congregations. But now we live in this very decentralized economy of information. So I don't go to my pastor to answer a question. I Google things, and as generations like Gen Z and Gen Alpha who are growing up as digital natives, meaning they don't know a world before the internet, they that impulse to look to the internet and to curate information from the web is increasingly kind of the standard. So pastors are kind of in this place where we feel, well, that my role is to dispense religious knowledge. And so there's this culture of more that comes alongside of that and says, well, if I'm going to, minister well to my congregation, I need to do more. I need to put out more content. I need to write more, blogs, or, do this or do that, and get my content out in order to, to impact the world. But the reality is that what we need is to begin to think through, because that's a hamster wheel that is just utterly and completely exhausting. Any of us that have a podcast or write books or do this know how much taxing that is, or how taxing that is. It takes something from you, and if you don't have good rhythms, if there's not a temperance to how frequently we're pouring out, eventually that well runs dry. And I would say to any pastors or church leaders of a local congregation that are listening or watching this, you're never going to compete with the Craig Rochelles and of Christianity, and these guys that have enormous teams at their disposal, have high production, all that kind of stuff, to be able to put out high quality content on a regular basis. They have literally a group of people that are bearing that load that in most of our local churches a pastor just does not have. And so we need to increasingly begin to recognize information is decentralized, meaning it's not all available in one place. People piecemeal it together. It's also democratized, meaning that your role as a provider of religious instruction is less important than it was a generation ago. So that inevitably begs the question: what is the role of the pastor in this emerging digital landscape? And the reality is that we need to move from seeing ourselves as dispensers of religious knowledge to cultivators of transformational community.
Yeah.
Because the one thing that people are hungry for, they're desperate for, that we as ministers and church leaders can actually answer, is creating vibrant, transformational environments where people can come together, they can encounter God together, and they can grow in their faith together in a way that you simply can't do in just simply retaining information or accumulating more information. So, discipleship inevitably has to, in both digital and physical spaces, has to take on a shape where we prioritize cultivating environments more than we do dispensing religious information.
Yeah. So true, so true, and I appreciate the way that you shared that, because it's in those spaces that relationship can happen, that conversation can happen, that interaction that can happen. Like you said, whether that's a digital space or a physical space, there's still communication, connection, story, right? People share their stories and we hear their stories, because it's in our stories that we get to know one another. It's in our stories that we connect. And so that's that's a great thing. And helping sort that out. So how, Todd, how do we, as we're trying to sort out those connections? I know you've done a lot of writing and you've done a lot of speaking kind of on this, really around some of the principles that we need to think about and consider in terms of digital ministry, digital discipleship, kind of, I guess I would call it having a healthy ministry perspective, right, when it comes to these things,
Yeah.
especially around this topic of discipleship. As a matter of fact, this is something that's just a huge passion of mine to talk about a lot, is kind of helping to redefine what do we really mean and how do we think about this term discipleship, and how are we defining it. So I think that's helpful, but could you talk a little bit about some of the principles, some of the things that we ought to consider around healthy ministry in a digital world?
Yeah, I think that first of all, there are two myths that are very dominant in local church leadership that need to be dispelled. The first is what I call the myth of digital replacement, which is one that I had when I was a church planter, which is if I expand our church's ministry presence online, people are going to prefer being online instead of being in person. So if I, continue broadcasting my services, people will just stay home and watch it online instead of coming in person. But research is showing that's actually not true. In fact, there are two main groups of people that are most engaged in a church's online kind of digital presence. The first is those who wouldn't darken the door of your church to begin with, who are either for whatever reason for another. There's a geographical limitation; they live far away. There's a personal limitation. They've been burned by the church before, or they're kind of in a shaky kind of deconstructing faith journey, and that's about the extent that they're willing to give at that present moment. Or the other group of people are those who are actually already most involved in your church to begin with. So I think it was Tom Rayner did a study when he was at Lifeway that showed that there's a cyclical relationship between your online audience and those who are attending in person. That the folks that are showing up online are often those who are otherwise super involved in small groups and leading a ministry, and they're away on vacation, or little Johnny's home, they're home with little Johnny sick or something like that. It's not, there are very, very few who are actually in proximity to your church making the willful choice that I'm going to attend church online and not go in person. And so that's an important myth to dispel, because we need to move to a place where we recognize, like, oh no, I can be free to offer online ministry options to engage digital environments, and not feel like I'm going to, people are just going to disappear in our physical gatherings. There's something deeply woven within us that still craves for face-to-face interaction. The second myth is the myth of digital, what I call authenticity, which means that people misrepresent themselves online more than they do in other places. And some of that's encouraged because we look and we see, anon accounts on Twitter/X. We see, people, we hear the stories of, the, middle-aged, creeper man that's, in, Snapchat posing as a 13-year-old girl and stuff like that. But again, studies show that people not only tend to not misrepresent themselves online any more than they do in person, but they actually, in some instances, are more authentic, more honest about who they are and their struggles and what they're going through than they would be in a physically mediated environment. So in our research that came through specifically with Gen Z, there would be, people that would mention, so and so in our youth group. I notice our kids are more apt to open up to our youth pastor in a WhatsApp thread than they are on a Wednesday night service in person. There are, Life Church, one of the kind of early adopters of VR church, virtual reality church, launched a campus in Meta, and all of that kind of stuff. Quickly found that people would just open up because that risk of face-to-face interaction wasn't there. So they were actually more willing to be transparent and honest about the deep struggles that they were enduring, because the risk of doing so was lessened. And so that's important, because we recognize that specifically when it comes to reaching people in discipleship type environments, there's tremendous opportunity to use digital environments to really kind of cut through some of the barriers that would exist in face-to-face interaction, specifically with young people. And so those are two key postures: that myth, dispelling that myth of digital replacement, and that myth of digital authenticity. As we approach discipleship and environments and encounters, the understanding those two is crucial to be able to pastor people well in digital spaces.
Yeah, so true. And I think I've found the same thing. And I think amongst our team here at our church, we've noticed the same thing, is that people will have a tendency, if I'm interacting to them, for example, like you said, in a WhatsApp group, or we've got some sort of an online thing where they're asking questions and there's comments coming back and whatever. Sometimes it might take 2 or 3 questions before they actually get to the thing that they really want to talk about,
Yeah.
but they get there pretty quickly. Whereas oftentimes, I think in some spaces in an in-person scenario, they're not sure it's an appropriate place or time, or they're concerned about, well, that person's busy, or what if somebody sees me, or whatever. So I,
Right.
I, I agree with you. I think, and the research clearly is shown that, is that we have opportunities there. We just have to make sure we're keeping the relationship side of it at the forefront. What are some of the guiding, like, principles we need to think about in terms of setting up or developing ministry, or expanding our digital ministry or our digital reach?
Yeah, so there's a paper that I wrote called "Digital Spaces and Places" that we can make available to
Yeah,
your
yeah,
readers, but or to your listeners. But in that, I talk about kind of the ecosystem of digital tools, and by that I mean, if you think through, kind of like a two-axis grid, one arrow going up and down, the other going horizontally left and right. If you think through a particular tool, a digital, like Facebook or Discord or Marco Polo, all of these different tools that people use to communicate on a regular basis. There are some that function more as digital spaces, and others that function more as digital places. And digital spaces are primarily where people go to get content or to receive information. There's not a lot of, social interaction or relational bonding that's happening, right? Think of a website. You don't go to, your people don't go to your church's website to build relationship. And as much as, with all the time and effort that you put into it, that's just not how that tool works, right? But digital places, by contrast, are places where, or are environments in digital spaces where people primarily go to receive and to cultivate community. So the focus isn't on content; the focus is on belonging. And so, if we think about, but these aren't digital tools are neither they're just a digital place or just a digital space. They kind of function along a spectrum, right? So, because you can get information from Facebook, but you can also go to Facebook and find community and groups and all sorts of things like that. And so, they're kind of in this never landing, kind of always evolving sort of along that spectrum of, to some extent, functioning on content, to some extent functioning on community, and then depending on what the tool or the environment is, will inevitably lean more into one than the other. A good example with social media is the difference between like a TikTok and a Facebook. So TikTok is purely content dissemination via video. You can't really cultivate community on TikTok. But on Facebook, there's a ton of different ways that you can cultivate digital community. Now, the other thing that we need to take a look at, so if we think about that as that horizontal line,
Mm-hmm.
the other is that vertical line of looking at what I call first, second, and third level environments. And by that, I refer to, there are some spaces where that are conducive for kind of large gatherings of people. Think of a Taylor Swift concert. People are coming together to see Taylor Swift, but that's where the relational tie ends, right? They're not like, becoming best friends afterwards. They're not, sidebarring and pouring their hearts out to one another. They're coming for that one specific purpose. And everything else that would otherwise bind them together is probably fairly shallow. But you take into consideration, a group of lifelong friends getting together in someone's living room. That is a deep conversational environment. You're not going to go to a Taylor Swift concert to have like a heart to heart, deep conversation among friends. That's what you do after the concert. And you sit in the living room because that space is more conducive for that kind of deep relational gathering. And so I say all that to say, different digital tools, and this works in physical community as well. We don't. One of the kind of pet peeves I have is in, as we've kind of desired to make the church more relevant and appropriate for outsiders, which is a good motivation. What we've done is eliminate what I call second space environment. So we have our first space environment, like our Sunday morning services, and we think that's where people gather together. Is kind of where people first meet each other, and then we say, well, relationship happens in small groups. That's true, but there's this excluded middle that's very important. It's Sunday school, where people are meeting. It's low risk, but they might learn a little bit more about the other person in the classroom. It's a church potluck where as you're spooning some bread pudding, you have a conversation over the table, or you sit down and introduce yourself and find out where the person at the table went to college and stuff like that. That excluded middle, what I could refer to as second spaces, has eroded in our churches. Think Sunday night services, Sunday school, church potlucks, church-wide parties, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying we have to do those specific things, but as we think about creating a relational pipeline where people can begin in relationship and not be immediately expected to be thrust into deep relationship, showing up at somebody's house that they don't know, and that there's a lot of risk involved in that, in terms of how people feel comfortable. The same is true we need to think through those different environments in digital environments. So there are some environments that, like an open Facebook group, I'm a part of one that is, it's an affinity based one devoted to all things sauna, or as we Finns say, sauna. But there's very little. The only affinity that we have is that we all love saunas, and apart from that, there's nothing else. That there's no bonding that happens. But there are other environments, that like a Zoom group or something like that, where that relationship takes a little bit extra depth. And then there are even deeper, more intimate digital environments, things like text threads, things like Marco Polo interactions, that are actually primed for people to actually talk and reveal deep parts of who they are, and to have that stewarded well in community. And so all of that to say, as we're approaching, and the paper kind of fleshes this out of how to create a pipeline that takes into consideration those different environments, we need to think through how are people in my church, specifically in digital environments, able to engage in space or in environments that are appropriate for the amount of relationship or the type of relationship development that I'm wanting to create, that I'm wanting them to be able to have. And then also, are the tools that I'm using in digital spaces appropriate for the kind of for what I'm wanting to get out of them? Am I using, my church website, for example, to try to develop community? It's just not
Yeah.
going to happen. But
Yeah.
and but also, text message threads aren't the greatest way to communicate information, long form information all of the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thinking through those different forms allows us to be moved to a place of intentionality and to steward those tools in a way that maximizes the capacity for relational development.
It's great. Yeah, and I think it's the intentionality part. It's the thinking it through. I know as a pastor, we have lots of things going on. We're busy.
Yeah.
We're trying to do all the things because Sunday happens every week. It's amazing. Every week
Yeah.
it comes around, right? There's services to plan. There's things that get done. There's babies to dedicate. There's weddings to happen. There's the list is on and on and on. There's small groups to create. We're trying to develop leaders. We're trying to do this. We're trying to grow that. But I think it's important to stop, make sure that we create some space where we're spending enough time with our leadership team, with the right people, to think through how we're utilizing these tools, to think through what the purpose is, to think through how do we maximize, as you say, to understand, is it this place and this space, what does it do, what does it not do, are we utilizing it as such, or are we trying to use this particular space for a purpose it was not designed for, therefore it doesn't accomplish, on and on and on and on and on. Because it really, I think, it is just incumbent upon us to be intentional, to think through, to slow down enough to ask the questions. And so that's why I appreciate people like you who are spending the vast majority of their time thinking about these things and studying them and helping us to think it through, because this digital world, especially as you say, we have Gen Z, Gen Alpha. These are the first generations who have only ever known a digital world, and so that is the place that they go. I found out, like, my daughter doesn't even go to Google anymore. Then this was a little bit of a shocker to me, but she's using things like, she's using TikTok as her search deal, right? So she's asking TikTok questions, which is a bit scary on one front, but it's a reality on another, right? So they're using YouTube has become one of the predominant search engines, and
Oh yeah.
my crazy Uncle Harry's videos are they're great, and but they may not be very helpful for some of the, he's going to give you some great information, I guarantee you, but it may not be helpful. So I think it's just important for us to understand that. So I really appreciate that. I wanna kind of tail end our conversation, Todd, and because I want to give you a minute to talk about, and this is a little segue. We're kind of taking a left turn here for a moment, because I want you to just to say just a little bit about your new book, Your Daughter Shall Prophesy, because it's a great book. Hopefully we'll get a chance to come back and just talk about this book, because it's really important. I think you've done some important work here. But just tell us a little bit, give us the highlight of the book. Why did you write the book? Why was it important? And love the title, Your Daughter Shall Prophesy. So tell us a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, and what it's all about.
Yeah, for sure. And to kind of have a little connective between
Go ahead, yeah,
this
because I made a
conversation.
fast left turn there.
Yeah, no.
That's fine. That's fine.
I will say shortly, if you follow me on Substack or social or something, I will have some more information probably in the next month or so to be able to share about my next book, which is more related to the topic that we're talking about. But on for Your Daughter Shall Prophesy, I wrote the book basically because I grew up a lot of times in modern conversation. The topic of women in ministry is one that's lumped in with a bunch of other like social progressive topics, and so a lot of people assume, well, if I affirm that women can be pastors, then I'm this liberal whatever that has abandoned the authority of scripture and all this kind of stuff. But I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition, which has been uh, ordaining women for well over 100 years, and is rooted in a broader tradition that has elevated the giftings and the place of women for hundreds of years before that. Thinking of the Wesleyan and holiness traditions, and so there's actually this rich history that in one way or another dates back to the early church. We see these different movements pop up of women kind of rising above the cultural expectations of the day and answering the call of God. But I grew up where women being pastors was kind of, it's like talking about water being wet. It was just very normal. But what I found though, as I began to work as a pastor, and in addition to being a pastor, I'm a pastor's husband. Tara is a pastor and a great pastor. And I found that my egalitarian, so that belief that men and women can equally carry out the call of God in their life, regardless of what that looks like in pastoral settings, church leadership settings, whatever, that my egalitarian theology and my egalitarian practice didn't always align. And a lot of times my ego would get in the way. A lot of times, my own sense of self-preservation or insecurity and whatnot would actually create barriers for Tara and other women that I ministered alongside in ways that I wasn't consciously doing, but was systemically doing. They were habits that I was creating. And what I began to realize in conversations with other pastors is a lot of times there's this disconnect between egalitarian theology and egalitarian practice. And a lot of times, those of us who affirm that women can be pastors stop short of, well, our theology is, well, we believe the right things, so we're good. We've got it all figured out. We're good. And in interviewing women in ministry for the book and having all these different conversations, I began to realize there's a lot of systemic issues at play in egalitarian churches where we need to practice what we preach. Talk about linking, like we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, linking knowledge and practice. And so I wrote the book out of a desire. It's not really a book, although I have a chapter that kind of walks through some basic arguments for women in ministry. But the book's not designed to convince people who are complementarian or whatever to be egalitarian. Instead, it's designed, and the hope is that it will empower egalitarians to be better egalitarians and to have practical tools and insights to understand how to move from kind of passion or move from passive supporters of women in ministry to passionate advocates. And so that's really what the book is about. And it came out in May. It's been received very well. And I'm excited to see what God does, not just through the book itself, but through the people who are inspired as a result of beginning some of these conversations that we really need to have in the church.
Great, great. I appreciate that. Thanks for letting me make that left turn over to that. I wanted to talk
For
about that.
sure.
Hopefully, we'll have another chance to have a conversation around that because there's a lot to talk about there. And
Yeah.
because, like you, I come from that tradition, and I think there's a lot that we can learn along that. But back over, back on the lane where we started. So on the digital front, Todd, any final thoughts around? Are there? And I know you're working on lots of resources. I know the research group and others. But what do you recommend for pastors and church leaders in terms of how should they just begin to think about where they are? What are some of the one or two things that they ought to consider today as they kind of process this digital world?
Yeah, I would say two things. The first is take an inventory of, because a lot of times, and I get it, like I've been there. You know, pastoral ministry is it's a grind. You know, at times, you know, we don't always like to talk about that, but Greg says, you know, Sunday come around with an alarming frequency. You know, and so we're, you know, we're kind of, we can get caught up in that weekly grind if we're not careful, if we're not intentional. And so, one thing to do, I would recommend, is take a step back and kind of do an inventory of where you are now, in terms of what your church does online, what you do personally as a church leader online, and kind of run a health check on it. Is it effective? Are there areas that are ineffective? And, you know, in my own personal engagement on the internet, am I just ranting about politics on, you know, on the internet all of the time? And ask yourself if that's an effective means of evangelism and discipleship in digital spaces. And then, but then not only assess where you are now, but then take a step back and look at, where is my congregation and where is my community spending the majority of your time, because you only have so many people, you have so many hours in the day, you only have so much resource that you can devote to online ministry. And so I say this, you know, I'll give an example. You know, when you and I were serving together in Jacksonville, you know, our church was very, and I would say our community as well, was very invested on Instagram. Didn't really spend a whole lot of the time on Twitter. And so I had to make a conscious choice when we moved and began to minister in Jacksonville. I need to actually spend more time on Instagram than I ever have, because I didn't really care about it. Our previous context wasn't on Instagram hardly at all, but they were deeply invested on Facebook. Now, when we were church planters, we felt like we had to kind of do everything. I mean, our church had its own Google Plus account. We had a Pinterest account, like, and tried to maintain it. Like, that, you talk about like wasted resources. You know, choose the, you know, the couple places, the wells from which your community and your congregation draws, and lean into those instead of trying to force them onto something else, because, you know, for whatever reason, go where they are currently and see how you can breathe life into that. The second thing that I would say, because a lot of the feedback that I get in having this conversation is limited resources, limited time, not knowing where to start. And what I would say is, listen to your youth. You know, there's a lot of, you know, felt need of, you know, how do we minister effectively to Gen Z? But this digital conversation and that Gen Z conversation have a lot of potential to overlap, because there's a lot of Gen Zers, and I would argue millennials as well, that are feeling increasingly disengaged from the kind of current structures of what it means to be involved in church. And so we're, you know, often telling, you know, a teenager or a 20 something that's got 30 million followers on TikTok, that the best way that they can be involved in the church is to greet at the door or to pour coffee in the church coffee shop on Sundays. And I'm not disparaging those roles. Those are great. But is that the best way to leverage the full scope of that young, you know, woman or man's giftings? I would say not. But Gen Z is incredibly digitally savvy. They are hungry for transformational community. A lot of the shifts that we need to make in the church are laden within kind of the native makeup of Gen Z. And there's a lot of potential to simply listen, present the opportunity, and solicit their involvement within your church to be a part of the solution. And I would venture to guess that if you do a good job listening, if you release control, which is hard for us to do at times, but if we release control and allow them to leverage what they do best, which is possessing digital knowledge, and while we come alongside and we leverage, as older generational cohorts, what we have to give, which is wisdom, then something beautiful can be created, and you can potentially really create something new and beautiful that your church may not have had before.
So important. Thanks, Todd. That's some great advice. I hope people will take that and really process it, think about it, because I think it's important that we slow down. I like to use the phrase, we have to stop long enough to actually think about what we need to be thinking about, and work through those processes and ask good questions, and do our research. And so super helpful. Thank you. Hopefully we get you back again and have some other deeper conversations. Looking forward to your book on this topic to come out here in the future. And so I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Everybody, this has been a great conversation. Listen, I hope that you will share this with at least one person that you know in the ministry that this would really help. This is a great conversation, so be sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, we'll see you again soon.